Consider this. On the morning of April 6, 1453, a single weapon fired its first shot and rendered 1,000 years of military architecture instantly obsolete. Not gradually, not over a generation, in one morning. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened at Constantinople, and understanding why it happened tells us something profound about the nature of power, technological disruption, and the terrifying speed at which civilizations collapse when they mistake the past for a guarantee of the future. A guard named Constantinos stands atop the Mesotechtion, the middle section of the great Theodosian Walls. To understand what these walls meant to the people behind them, you must abandon your modern sense of time. They had been standing unbreached for over 1,000 years. They turned back Attila the Hun. They stopped the Avars, the Arabs, the Bulgarians, and the Rus. When these walls were first built in the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had not yet fallen. The religion of Islam did not yet exist, and still these walls stood. To stand upon them in 1453 was not simply to stand on stone, it was to stand on 1,000 years of unbroken proof that the city could not fall. The triple-layered defense below him represents the pinnacle of military engineering, a wide moat, a low outer wall to slow advancing forces, then the massive inner wall rising 30 feet into the air. Behind him lie the domes of the world's greatest city. Before him lies the dust of history's failed conquerors, an unbroken record that had become, for the Byzantines, something dangerously close to theological certainty. The soldiers on the battlements mock the Turks below, shouting insults into the valley. This is not mere bravado. It is the behavior of men who have internalized history as armor. The biggest threat Constantinos faces on a typical morning is the biting wind off the Sea of Marmara or the creeping hunger of a city under blockade. He watches the enemy soldiers digging trenches and positioning their smaller artillery, but it all feels like a familiar play performed by a new cast. The routine of the siege has set in, a slow, grinding rhythm of arrows and occasional stone projectiles that bounce harmlessly off the reinforced limestone. Then the rhythm changes. It starts as a vibration in the soles of his boots, a low-frequency thrumming that seems to come from the earth itself. It is the sound of 60 oxen straining against their yokes and 200 men shouting in unison. From the edge of the horizon, a shape emerges that defies his entire understanding of warfare. A massive 27-foot-long bronze cylinder, glowing a dull, lethal orange in the morning sun. This is the Orban, named for its Hungarian creator, a master gunsmith who had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI. The emperor, his treasury nearly empty from decades of imperial decline, could not meet the man's price. So Orban crossed the lines, sought an audience with Sultan Mehmed II, and found a patron who understood that this weapon was not merely a cannon. It was history's hinge. It had taken weeks to haul the weapon just a few miles, across roads specially reinforced to bear its weight. A later account records that when it was test-fired at Adrianople before the campaign, the sound carried 14 miles, and the projectile buried itself 6 feet into the earth. Word had been sent to towns along the route so that pregnant women would not miscarry from the sound of the test shots. As it is finally hauled into position before the Theodosian Walls, the mockery on the battlements dies away. Not gradually. It simply stops, as if someone has cut a rope. The guard looks through the embrasure, and for the first time in his life, the wall beneath him feels small. He watches the Ottoman engineers begin the ritual of the kill. They pour massive quantities of black powder into the breach, a substance that smells of sulfur, of a world the Byzantines had not been prepared for. Giant wooden beams brace the weapon against recoil. The process takes hours. The sun climbs higher, and the tension on the walls becomes something physical, something that sits in the chest and does not move. Constantinos looks at the other men on the ramparts. They are holding spears and shields, tools that have worked for 3,000 years of organized warfare, but they are staring at the cannon with the eyes of men who had just realized they are holding sticks. A 1,200-pound stone ball is hoisted into the mouth of the bronze beast. He thinks of the 15 feet of solid masonry beneath him, and for the first time he doubts it. The moment of ignition is not first a sound. It is a vacuum. For a terrible split second, the cannon appears to suck all the air out of the valley. Then comes the roar, by all historical accounts, the loudest single sound produced by human hands at any point in recorded history up to that moment. The Byzantine historian Daucus, writing shortly after the fall, described it as something that seemed to announce the end of an age. He was more right than he knew. Constantinos sees a wall of white smoke erupt from the Ottoman lines, and a heartbeat later the world explodes. He doesn't see the projectile. No one does. He only feels the result. The impact is 1,200 pounds of shaped stone striking masonry at terminal velocity, a physics equation with a verdict that has been 1,000 years in the making. The wall does not crack. A section of the outer fortification simply ceases to exist. Where there was once a solid, crenellated defense, there is now a jagged breach of rubble and splintered timber and the white powder of pulverized limestone. The stone has been returned to dust in a single second. Here is what historians often fail to emphasize. What broke in that moment was not merely stone. It was a psychological architecture that an entire civilization had built its identity upon. The Byzantines had survived so long as the people behind the walls that they had, perhaps fatally, confused the walls with the reason for their survival. The walls were a tool, brilliant, extraordinary, unprecedented, but a tool, and tools can be superseded. The guard realizes something military theorists would not formally articulate for centuries. The height of the walls, always their greatest strength, has become their greatest weakness. The higher the wall, the more catastrophic the fall. He looks out at the Ottoman lines and sees the engineers already cooling the bronze barrel with oil, preparing to reload. They will fire 7 times in a day. 7 times is enough. By mid-afternoon, the air is thick with sulfur and the rhythmic pounding of smaller cannons following the Orban's lead. Constantinos stands in the settling dust, his tunic gray with the powder of his own defenses. He watches the Emperor's elite guards rushing to fill the breach with baskets of earth and wooden stakes, a desperate improvisation and actually a sound one, since soft materials absorb shock better than hard stone. But you cannot sandbag your way out of a paradigm shift. The invasion has not yet entered the city. The walls still stand in places. But Constantinos understands, with the terrible clarity that only catastrophe provides, that the city has already fallen. Not because the Ottomans are at the gate, but because the idea that sustained the city, the faith in stone, and history and divine protection, has been exposed as a story about the past, dressed up as a guarantee of the future. Constantinople would hold on for another 7 weeks. Constantine XI, the last emperor, would die in the final breach, sword in hand, refusing the surrender that might have saved his life. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces entered through the breach in the Mesotikian. The Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of Rome, the civilization that had preserved Greek philosophy and Roman law, ceased to exist. The Middle Ages, by the consensus of most historians, ended on that day. And it ended not with a treaty or a political negotiation or a gradual cultural shift. It ended with a match, a measure of black powder, and the sound of stone becoming dust. That is what Constantinos understood, standing in the gray powder of a wall that was never supposed to fall. The future does not negotiate with the past. It does not send a warning. It does not respect precedent. It simply arrives, proves its point, and moves on, leaving behind men in armor holding shields, wondering when exactly the world changed. It changed at dawn, on a Tuesday morning in April, with 60 oxen, 200 men, and 1 Hungarian engineer whose emperor could not afford him.